My name is Leora Grant, and I'm 34 years old. 7 years ago, my sister told my parents that I had dropped out of medical school. She lied. That lie erased me from my own family. My parents stopped answering my calls. They blocked my number. They didn't come to my residency graduation. They weren't at my wedding. For 7 years, I existed in the strange silence between memories like a photograph cut out of the family album. I wasn't anyone's daughter. Then last month, everything changed. My sister was rushed into the emergency room after a car accident. Severe internal bleeding. Unconscious. Minutes away from dying. The trauma team paged the chief surgeon. When the operating room doors opened and my mother saw the name stitched across the white coat walking toward her daughter's stretcher, she grabbed my father's arm so tightly her fingers left crescent-shaped marks in his skin. Before continuing, take a few seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. And remember, only do so if the story truly touches your heart. I also want to know where you are and what the temperature is where you live. Now let's rewind time together. Back to the fall of 2019. Back to a kitchen table in Boulder, Colorado, and the last time my father ever looked at me with something that resembled pride. Growing up in the Grant household, there were two daughters, but only one who seemed to orbit the sun. My older sister Vanessa was 3 years older than me, and born with a kind of effortless brightness. She was the girl who could walk into a room and immediately command its school plays, debate competitions, student council meetings. People didn't just notice Vanessa, they revolved around her. My parents, Daniel and Carol Grant, loved that about her. My father managed a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. My mother worked part-time as a bookkeeper. We were a middle-class family, the kind that believed appearances mattered almost as much as reality. And Vanessa delivered the perfect picture every time. I was different, quieter. While Vanessa held court at the dinner table telling stories that made my parents laugh, I was usually sitting at the edge of the room with a biology textbook open on my lap. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't difficult. I was simply the background, like a shadow cast by someone standing in brighter light. There's a difference between being forgotten and never truly being seen. Here's a small example. In 8th grade, I qualified for the state science fair, the only student from my school to make it that year. The competition happened the same weekend Vanessa had a performance in a community theater production. You can probably guess where my parents went. When I came home with a second-place ribbon, my father glanced at it for a moment and said, "That's nice, Leora." Then he set it down like it was just another receipt. He never asked what my project was about. He never did. So I told myself it didn't matter. Instead, I poured everything into school grades, advanced classes, scholarship applications. If I couldn't be the daughter they noticed, I would become the daughter they couldn't ignore. And for one brief, shining moment I was, because the day my medical school acceptance letter arrived, something shifted in our house. For the first time in my life, my father looked directly at me, not past me, not through me, and said 5 words I had waited 18 years to hear. But before I tell you what he said, you need to understand something. The moment the spotlight started moving toward me, my sister noticed. And Vanessa Grant had never been the kind of person who shared the light. I have a small note. This is a fictional story aided by artificial intelligence to make the emotional experience more powerful and engaging. I hope it leaves a lasting impression on you, but if you're feeling tired right now, please take some time to rest and take care of yourself. The story will still be here when you return. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I remember the exact color of the envelope, thick ivory paper that felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of an entirely new life inside it. At the time, Vanessa was visiting for the weekend. She was 25, already working as a marketing coordinator at a firm in Denver. It was a good job, a respectable job, the kind of job that sounded impressive enough at family dinners. But good had always been Vanessa's ceiling, And for someone who had spent her whole life being the center of attention, even a small shift in gravity felt dangerous. My father opened the letter at the kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the lemon cleaner my mother used every morning. Sunlight poured through the window, landing across the envelope like a spotlight. He adjusted his glasses and read the first line silently. Then his eyebrows lifted. Oregon Health and Science University. He said slowly, as if tasting the words. That's a real medical school. He looked up at me. Not through me, not past me, at me. For a moment the world felt perfectly still, like the quiet pause between heartbeats. Maybe you'll make something of yourself after all, Leora. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it was the closest thing to pride I had ever heard in his voice, and I held on to those words the way a drowning person holds on to air. My mother called her sister that evening. Then she called a neighbor. Then another. Leora got into medical school, she kept saying, her voice bright with a kind of excitement I had never heard directed toward me before. At dinner that night, I glanced across the table at Vanessa. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that stops at the mouth. Her eyes were doing something else entirely. Calculating, measuring, rebalancing the room like a chess player studying a board that had suddenly shifted. I didn't recognize it then. At the time, I just thought she was tired from the drive. That week, Vanessa started calling me more often. 2 or 3 times. Sometimes late at night. "How's packing going?" she'd ask casually. "Have you met your roommate yet? What's Portland like?" She asked about everything: my professors, my classes, the orientation schedule, even the names of my future classmates. And she remembered them. Every single one. At the time, it felt like a miracle. For the first time in my life, my sister seemed genuinely interested in me. I thought maybe medical school had unlocked something between us. Respect. Connection. The fragile, invisible thread that normal sisters seem to share without effort. So I told her everything. Every detail. Every plan. Every fear. I handed her pieces of my life the way someone hands flowers to a friend, open palms, grateful smile, completely unaware they were offering ammunition. The first 2 years of medical school were brutal, but exhilarating. The workload was relentless, like trying to drink from a fire hose while running uphill. But I loved it. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My closest friend during those years was my roommate, Sarah Delgado. Sarah had grown up in the foster care system and had no real family to speak of, but she possessed a kind of stubborn warmth that filled every room she walked into. If Vanessa was sunlight bright but blinding, Sarah was a fireplace. Steady, quiet, constant. She was the reason I survived my first year. One night during finals week, when I called home exhausted and my mother said she couldn't talk because Vanessa had a stressful day at work, it was Sarah who sat cross-legged on our apartment floor and shoved a stack of anatomy flashcards toward me. "Their loss," she said. "Now get up. We've got organs to memorize." I laughed for the first time in days. But life has a strange way of breaking open when you least expect it. And for me, everything cracked apart during the 3rd year of medical school. Because that was the year Sarah got sick. And the year Vanessa decided to destroy my life. Sarah was diagnosed on a humid afternoon in August. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Even now, years later, those 4 words still feel like stones dropped into the quiet water of my memory. The kind that send ripples through everything that comes after. The doctor who delivered the news spoke gently, carefully, like someone placing fragile glass on a table. But there are some truths that no softness can cushion. Sarah listened in silence. I remember watching her hands while the doctor explained treatment options. They rested in her lap perfectly still, as if the rest of her body had already understood something her mind was still catching up to. When the doctor finished, she simply nodded once. Then she turned to me and said, "Well, that's inconvenient." That was Sarah. Humor even with the ground opening beneath her feet. She had no family to call. No parents, no siblings. Only a few distant foster connections that had faded years earlier. In the quiet hallway outside the oncology office, she leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "You've got rotations." I didn't even let her finish the sentence. The next morning, I went straight to the dean's office. Medical schools don't pause for personal tragedies. The pace is relentless, like a train that never stops moving no matter who falls off along the way. But when I explained the situation, the dean listened carefully. After a long moment, he nodded. "1 semester leave of absence," he said. "Caregiver status. Paperwork was filed. My spot in the program was secured. I would return in January. Everything was official, documented, approved." I moved into Sarah's small apartment 2 days later. For the next 3 months, my life shrank into hospital corridors and quiet rooms filled with the low hum of machines. I drove her to chemotherapy appointments, learned how to read medication schedules, and held her hand during the nights when the pain was so sharp it stole the air from her lungs. At 3 in the morning, the oncology ward feels like another world. Dim lights, soft footsteps, the slow rhythm of monitors beeping like distant metronomes. Sometimes Sarah would drift in and out of sleep, and I'd sit beside the bed studying anatomy notes under the glow of my laptop screen. We joked that I was getting the most intense practical lesson in pancreatic anatomy any student could ever receive. But beneath the jokes, time was running out. At some point during those months, I made a mistake. I called Vanessa. Even now, I don't know why. Maybe I still believed she was the sister she had pretended to be during those late-night phone calls. Maybe I thought that if anyone in my family could understand compassion, it might be her. I told her everything. About Sarah, about the diagnosis, about the leave of absence, about the plan to return to school in the spring semester. Vanessa's voice on the phone was soft, almost syrupy with sympathy. "Oh my God, Leora," she said. "That's horrible. I'm so sorry." For a moment, I felt relief spread through me like warmth. Finally, I thought. Finally, she understands. "Don't worry," Vanessa continued. "I won't say anything to Mom and Dad. They'd just panic." I remember thanking her. 3 days later, she called my parents. I didn't know the exact words she used that night. I wouldn't discover the full shape of the lie until years later when the truth unraveled in a place none of us expected. But the damage started almost immediately. The call came at 11 o'clock that night. I was sitting beside Sarah's hospital bed in a hard plastic chair when my phone lit up. "Dad." For a moment, hope flickered in my chest like a small candle. Maybe Vanessa had told them about Sarah. Maybe they were calling to ask how we were doing. I answered. "Leora," my father said. His voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "Your sister told us everything." The candle inside me went out. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "The dropping out," he continued flatly. "The boyfriend with the drug problem. All of it." I pressed my hand against the hospital wall to steady myself. "Dad, that's not true." "She showed us the messages," he said. "Proof." "What messages?" I whispered. Behind the curtain, Sarah's IV pump beeped quietly. "Dad, I'm sitting in a hospital right now. I'm taking care of my friend." A long pause followed. Then he said something that felt like a door slamming shut. "Vanessa said you'd say exactly that. Vanessa said you'd say exactly that." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The hospital room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls had moved closer while I wasn't looking. "Dad," I said slowly, forcing each word to stay steady. I didn't drop out. "I filed a leave of absence. I can show you the paperwork. I can give you the dean's number." My father didn't hesitate. "Enough. Just one word. Cold. Flat. Final." Then my mother's voice joined the call. I could hear it trembling through the speaker. "How could you lie to us for a whole year, Leora? The accusation hit me like a sudden drop in an elevator. "Mom, please," I said. "You have to listen to me. We trusted you." She continued, her voice cracking. "We told everyone you were in medical school. Do you know how humiliating it is to find out your daughter dropped out and hid it?" I pressed my forehead against the cool hospital wall. "Mom, I didn't drop out." "She said you have a boyfriend," my father added sharply. "Someone with a drug problem. That you've been helping him instead of finishing school." I closed my eyes. It was like trying to hold water in my hands, every explanation slipping through their fingers before it even landed. "Dad?" I whispered. "I'm sitting in a hospital room right now. My friend has stage 4 cancer. I took a leave of absence to take care of her." Silence. For a moment, I hoped they might hear the truth inside my voice. Then my father spoke again. "Vanessa warned us you'd have a story ready." Something inside my chest cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet fracture like ice forming across the surface of a lake. "Don't call this house again," he said. "Not until you're ready to tell the truth." The line went dead. I stared at my phone. 4 minutes. That was how long it took my parents to erase me. 4 minutes to rewrite 27 years of my life. I slid down the wall and sat on the hospital floor, the cold linoleum pressing through my scrubs. On the other side of the curtain, Sarah's IV monitor beeped softly, steady as a heartbeat. My phone screen still glowed in my hand. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. 20 minutes later, a text appeared. "Vanessa. I'm sorry, Leora. I had to tell them. I couldn't keep your secret anymore." There was a broken heart emoji at the end. I stared at the message for a long time. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives with thunder. Most of the time it slips in quietly, wearing the familiar face of someone you trust. I was nearly 2,000 miles from home. I had $43 in my bank account. And suddenly, I had no family. But I tried. I need you to understand that. I tried everything. Over the next 5 days, I called my parents 14 times. The first few calls went straight to voicemail. By the 4th day, my father's number had blocked me. My mother blocked me 2 days later. I sent 2 emails. One short, one long. The long one had my official leave of absence paperwork attached as a PDF. I included the dean's direct phone number. I even added the contact information for Sarah's oncologist. Everything a reasonable person would need to verify the truth. Neither email received a response. I wrote a handwritten letter and mailed it priority from Portland. 5 days later, it came back. Return to sender. Unopened. My mother's handwriting was on the envelope. I recognized it immediately. Desperation makes you creative. I called my Aunt Lydia, my father's younger sister, and the only person in the family who had ever treated me like I mattered just as much as Vanessa. She listened quietly while I explained everything. "I'll talk to your father," she promised. She called me back 40 minutes later. Her voice sounded tired. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said gently. "He told me to stay out of it." I swallowed. "What exactly did he say?" There was a pause. Then she sighed. "He said you made your bed. 5 days, 14 phone calls, 2 emails, 1 letter, 1 desperate attempt through a relative. Every single one rejected, blocked, returned. And the worst part, none of it was new. This was the pattern of my entire childhood, every missed science fair, every forgotten recital, every time Vanessa's version of events was accepted without question, while mine was quietly dismissed. This was just the loudest version of something that had always been true. On the 6th day, I stopped calling, not because I gave up, but because I finally understood something. They hadn't just believed Vanessa, they had chosen her. And maybe they always had. Sarah died on a quiet Sunday morning in December. The snow outside the hospice window had begun to fall sometime during the night, soft and steady, turning the world beyond the glass into something pale and silent. Inside the room, the only sound was the slow rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep. Pause. Beep. Pause. I was sitting beside her bed with a paperback textbook open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single word for nearly an hour. Sarah had been asleep most of the morning, her breathing shallow like someone slowly drifting farther from shore. Around 9:17 a.m., the monitor gave a long, continuous tone. No drama, no final speech. Just a straight line across a small glowing screen. It was strange how something so quiet could feel so enormous, like the sky itself had suddenly collapsed inward. I sat there for a long time. The nurse eventually came in, checked the monitor, and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said softly. But the truth was, Sarah had known before any of us. She had known weeks earlier. That was why she left me the note. I found it later that evening while packing the few things she had kept beside her bed. Tucked inside her copy of Gray's Anatomy between the pages on pancreatic anatomy was a yellow sticky note. Her handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "Finish what you started, Leora. Become the doctor I know you are. And don't let anyone, especially your own family, tell you who you are." I sat on the edge of the bed holding that note for a long time. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the apartment felt hollow like a house after the furniture has been moved out. Sarah had been the one steady thing in my life for 3 years. And now, she was gone. I organized a small funeral the following week. 6 people attended. Sarah's former foster sister drove down from Eugene. 2 classmates from medical school came along with 1 nurse from the oncology ward who had grown fond of her. I stood at the front of a chapel that could hold 60 people and read a eulogy to rows of mostly empty seats. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't broken, but because I had already cried every day for 3 months, and there was simply nothing left. That night, I returned to Sarah's apartment, our apartment. Her coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter. Her jacket still hung by the door like she might come back and reach for it. I opened my laptop and stared at the medical school re-enrollment form. The cursor blinked on the screen like a small, impatient heartbeat. 2 choices: quit or continue. Part of me wanted to close the laptop and disappear, start a different life somewhere far away where no one knew my name or my history. But Sarah's note lay beside the keyboard. Her words felt like a quiet hand on my shoulder steadying me. So I filled out the form, 1 line at a time. When I finished, I pressed submit. Sometimes people imagine strength as something loud like a battle cry or a triumphant speech. But the truth is, strength often looks much smaller than that. Sometimes it's just a tired person sitting alone in a quiet room choosing to stand up again when no one else is watching. I returned to medical school in January. No family, no safety net. Just a student loan balance that grew like ivy and a determination that had hardened into something stronger than grief. Medical school doesn't slow down for heartbreak. Exams arrive on schedule. Clinical rotations begin at dawn whether you slept or not. Patients still need care even if your own life feels like it's falling apart. So I worked. I studied like my future depended on it. Because in many ways, it did. And slowly, piece by piece, I built something new. A life that no longer needed my family's approval to exist. What I didn't know then was that while I was rebuilding my life from the ground up, Vanessa was still rebuilding the lie. I graduated from medical school on time. The ceremony took place on a bright May morning, the kind of day that feels almost too beautiful for the seriousness of the moment. The sky above the campus was clear and blue, stretching wide like an open promise. Rows of folding chairs filled the courtyard. Families held cameras. Parents waved proudly from the crowd. When my name was called, I walked across the stage in my cap and gown and shook the dean's hand. For a brief second, applause echoed around me. But when I looked out at the audience, the seat reserved for my family was empty. An empty chair can feel louder than a cheering crowd. Still, I smiled for the photograph. Not because I was happy, but because I had worked too hard to let absence steal the moment. After graduation, I matched into a surgical residency at Mercy Ridge Medical Center on the East Coast, a Level 1 trauma hospital known for its brutal pace and unforgiving expectations. The kind of place where mistakes aren't measured in grades, they're measured in heartbeats. Residency was exactly as intense as everyone warns you. 14-hour shifts, sometimes longer. Nights blurred into mornings under the cold glow of fluorescent hospital lights. Coffee replaced sleep. Meals became whatever you could eat standing up in 5 minutes between cases. But strangely, the chaos helped. Work became a kind of armor. Every patient was a problem to solve, a life balanced delicately between skill and time. When you're trying to stop someone from bleeding out on an operating table, there's very little room left for old wounds. And slowly, I started to build something that felt like stability. During my second year of residency, I met Dr. Margaret Ellis. She was 58 years old, chief of surgery at Mercy Ridge, and the kind of woman who could silence an entire operating room with a single raised eyebrow. Her reputation in trauma surgery was legendary. But beneath the steel exterior was something else. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal shift, she stopped me in the hallway. "You don't talk about your family?" she said. It wasn't a question. I shrugged. "There's not much to talk about." She studied me for a moment the way experienced surgeons study X-rays, quietly searching for fractures beneath the surface. Finally, she nodded. "Good," she said. "Less distraction." Then she handed me a new patient file and walked away. It was the closest thing to compassion she ever showed. And somehow, it was exactly what I needed. A year later, I met Nathan Carter. He wasn't a doctor. Nathan was a civil rights attorney volunteering part-time at a legal clinic attached to the hospital. Calm voice, thoughtful eyes, the kind of man who listened fully before he spoke. The first time I told him my story, I expected pity, or disbelief, or the awkward silence people use when they don't know how to respond to pain. Instead, he just sat quietly across the table and let me finish. When I was done, he said 4 words. "You deserved better than that." It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like someone opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut for years. 2 years later, we got married in Dr. Ellis's backyard. 30 guests, warm October sunlight. Nathan's father walked me down the aisle. I sent an invitation to my parents. The envelope came back a week later, unopened. The same way my letter had years before. But Aunt Lydia came. She cried enough for 3 people. After the ceremony, Dr. Ellis handed me a sealed envelope. "Nomination paperwork," she said. For what I asked. "You'll find out," she replied. I tucked it into my desk drawer and forgot about it. 5 years passed. And somewhere during those years, I stopped being the girl who had been abandoned. I became someone else entirely. Someone my family wouldn't recognize anymore. What I didn't know was that life was about to bring all of us back together again, in the most brutal way imaginable. At 3:07 in the morning on a Thursday in January, when my pager went off. The pager dragged me out of sleep like a hand pulling someone from deep water. 3:07 a.m. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand. Beside me, Nathan shifted slightly but didn't wake. At the foot of the bed, our golden retriever, Hippocrates Hippo for short, lifted his head and blinked at me with sleepy confusion. The pager screen glowed. Level 1 trauma, MVC, single female, 35. Severe abdominal trauma, hemodynamically unstable. ETA 8 minutes. Adrenaline moved through my body, instantly sharp and electric. I was out of bed in seconds. 4 minutes later, I was dressed. 6 minutes later, I was driving through the empty January streets toward Mercy Ridge Medical Center. The roads were wet and dark, reflecting the yellow streetlights like shattered mirrors. Connecticut winters have a particular kind of darkness, the deep, quiet kind that makes the whole world feel suspended. My mind moved automatically through the checklist the way it always did during trauma calls. Motor vehicle collision, blunt abdominal trauma, unstable vitals, possible splenic rupture, possible liver laceration, maybe internal hemorrhage. I had performed variations of this surgery dozens of times. Still, every trauma case carries the same silent urgency, a race against the body's clock. Blood can disappear faster than time. I badged through the ambulance entrance and headed straight toward the trauma bay. The night team was already assembling. 2 residents, a trauma nurse, an anesthesiologist preparing medications. The hospital hummed with the controlled tension of people who had done this dance many times before. At the charge station, I picked up the intake tablet and pulled up the incoming patient's chart. Then I stopped walking. The name on the screen felt like a sudden crack of lightning. Patient Vanessa Grant. Doe. B. March 14, 1991. Emergency contact Daniel Grant father. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, the hospital sounds around me faded. The squeak of shoes on linoleum, the distant overhead announcements, the soft mechanical beeping of monitors. All of it pulled back like a tide receding from the shore. Suddenly, I wasn't the chief trauma surgeon anymore. I was 27 again, sitting on a hospital floor in Portland with a phone in my hand, listening to a dial tone that had erased my family. Dr. Grant Linda, the charge nurse, appeared beside me. "You okay?" I blinked once and set the tablet down. "I'm fine." My voice came out calm, controlled. Years of surgical training had built that composure like reinforced steel. "Prep Trauma Bay 2, I said, and page Dr. Patel. I want him on standby." Linda nodded and hurried off. In the distance, I heard it, the rising wail of an ambulance siren. Closer, closer. The sound cut through the winter air like a blade, and behind that ambulance, I knew before I even saw them, there would be 2 people I hadn't spoken to in 7 years. My parents. The ambulance doors burst open seconds later. The stretcher rolled fast through the trauma entrance. Vanessa lay strapped down unconscious. Her face was pale beneath the oxygen mask. Blood stained the front of her shirt. One arm hung limply over the side rail as paramedics rattled off vitals. BP dropping, one of them said. Pulse 140 and climbing. The trauma team moved quickly, surrounding the stretcher like a practiced storm. Then I saw them, running down the hallway behind the paramedics. My parents. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her hair thinner, her face drawn with fear. She was wearing a bathrobe and mismatched slippers like she had rushed out of the house without thinking. My father looked older too, older and terrified. "That's my daughter," he shouted past the triage nurse. "Where are you taking her? I need to talk to the doctor in charge." The nurse raised both hands calmly. "Sir, please wait in the surgical waiting area. The trauma team is already here. The chief surgeon is handling this personally." My father grabbed the nurse's arm. "Then get me the chief right now." The nurse glanced through the glass wall toward the trauma bay. Toward me. Her eyes flicked to the name on my badge. Dr. Leora Grant, Chief of Trauma Surgery. For a brief second, her eyes widened. I gave a small shake of my head. Not yet. Not like this. The trauma bay doors swung open and the stretcher rolled inside. Everything moved quickly after that, the way it always does during a critical trauma. Nurses cutting away clothing, monitors snapping to life, gloves snapping tight against wrists, controlled chaos. BP 70/40, someone called. Heart rate 152. Large bore IVs running. Vanessa lay on the table beneath the surgical lights, pale and motionless. Blood darkened the fabric of her shirt, spreading slowly like ink across paper. For a moment, the sight of her knocked the air out of me. 7 years had passed since I'd last seen her. But suddenly, every memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. The sister who had once shared a bedroom with me, the girl who had borrowed my clothes, without asking, the voice that had called our parents and quietly dismantled my life. Now she looked smaller, fragile, human. Not the villain I had spent years imagining, but a body fighting desperately to stay alive. "Fast ultrasound ready," a resident said. The probe moved across her abdomen. Dark fluid bloomed across the screen. Internal bleeding. "Positive fast," the resident confirmed. I exhaled slowly, just as I suspected. "Prep for surgery," I said. The words felt automatic muscle memory built from years of trauma work. But before we moved her to the operating room, I allowed myself 30 seconds. 30 seconds alone in the scrub room. I turned on the sink and let hot water run over my hands while I stared at my reflection in the steel mirror. The woman looking back at me was calm, focused, but beneath the surface something churned like deep water beneath ice. Part of me wanted to step away. Call Dr. Patel. Let someone else handle the case. Let my parents sit in the waiting room wondering which anonymous surgeon had saved their daughter. Let them walk away, never knowing that the daughter they abandoned had been standing right there. It would have been easier, cleaner. But medicine doesn't work that way. On the other side of the wall was a patient with a ruptured spleen and a probable liver laceration. She had maybe 30 minutes left if we didn't operate. And whether I liked it or not, I was the best surgeon available. The oath I took years ago didn't include exceptions for personal history. I grabbed the phone mounted on the wall and paged Dr. Patel directly. "I need you on standby," I said when he answered. "Complication?" he asked. "Conflict of interest," I replied. A pause. Then his voice turned serious. "Family? Yes." Another pause. "Understood," he said. "I'll be there." I hung up and dried my hands. Then I stepped back into the operating room. Vanessa lay under the bright surgical lights unconscious, her breathing shallow beneath the oxygen mask. For a moment I simply looked at her. 7 years of silence stood between us like a canyon. But on the operating table, none of that mattered. In surgery, every patient becomes the same thing. A life balanced on the edge of time. I pulled on my gloves. "Scalpel," I said. The room fell into focused silence as the procedure began. 3 hours later, the operating room clock read 6:48 a.m. The surgery had taken everything. Her spleen was completely ruptured, we removed it. Her liver had a deep laceration that required delicate suturing, each stitch placed carefully like repairing a tear in fragile fabric. 2 mesenteric vessels were bleeding internally. We clamped them, repaired them, stopped the hemorrhage. My hands never shook. Years of training had turned them into instruments, steady, precise, detached. Finally, I placed the last stitch. Vital stabilizing anesthesia said quietly. A slow breath moved through the room. Vanessa Grant was alive. Dr. Patel, who had stood silently near the wall throughout the procedure, lowered his mask. "That was flawless," he said softly. I removed my gloves and dropped them into the bin. There was still one final part of the operation left. Not in the operating room, but in the waiting room down the hall, where 2 people sat who hadn't spoken to me in 7 years and had no idea who had just saved their daughter's life. I washed my hands slowly in the scrub room. Not because they were dirty, 3 rounds of surgical disinfectant had already stripped my skin raw, but because I needed a moment. Water ran over my fingers, warm and steady. In the stainless steel mirror above the sink, my reflection stared back at me. Same face, same tired eyes, same hospital badge clipped to my scrubs. Dr. Leora Grant, Chief of Trauma Surgery. 7 years ago, my parents had believed I was a dropout, a disappointment, a daughter who had thrown her future away. And now I was about to walk into a waiting room and tell them I had just saved their other daughter's life. I dried my hands and straightened my scrub top. Then I walked down the hallway. The waiting room had that particular early morning stillness hospitals often have around sunrise. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. A television in the corner murmured a weather report that nobody was listening to, and in the center row of chairs sat my parents. They looked smaller than I remembered. Fear has a way of shrinking people. My mother's hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. My father sat rigid beside her, staring at the floor like a man trying to calculate something impossible. When the door opened, they both looked up. My father stood first. He had always been the one who stood first. "Doctor," he said quickly, stepping toward me. "How is she?" "Is my daughter." He stopped. His eyes had dropped to the badge hanging from my chest. Then they lifted to my face, then back to the badge. Recognition moved across his expression slowly, like a storm rolling across an empty field. My mother followed his gaze a second later. Her breath caught sharply. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The silence stretched long and fragile, like glass about to crack. Finally, I broke it. "Mr. and Mrs. Grant," I said calmly, my voice steady in the way years of hospital conversations had trained it to be. "Your daughter sustained a ruptured spleen and a significant liver laceration in the accident." My father blinked, still trying to assemble the reality standing in front of him. "The surgery was successful," I continued. "She's stable and currently recovering in the ICU. You'll be able to see her within the hour." I deliberately kept my tone professional. Clinical. Controlled. Not Mom and Dad. Mr. and Mrs. Grant. The distance between those two titles felt like an ocean. My mother took a step toward me, tears suddenly spilling down her face. "Leora," she whispered. The way she said my name sounded like someone discovering a word they thought had been erased from the dictionary. "Oh my God. Leora." Her arms lifted instinctively as if she meant to hug me. I stepped back. Just half a step. But it was enough. She froze. Her hands hung awkwardly in the air before slowly lowering to her sides. My father still looked stunned. "You're a doctor?" he said hoarsely. "I am." "You're the chief surgeon." "I am." He stared at me as if the world had quietly rearranged itself while he wasn't looking. But Vanessa said he stopped. The rest of the sentence seemed to collapse under its own weight. I tilted my head slightly. Vanessa said what exactly? He opened his mouth. Closed it. For perhaps the first time in my life, my father had no answer ready. My mother's voice trembled. We thought you dropped out. That you disappeared. That you didn't want anything to do with us." I met her eyes. None of that was true. The words came out quietly. But quiet truths often land harder than loud ones. "I sent emails," I continued. 2 of them. One with my leave of absence paperwork attached. My father looked down at the floor. "I called 14 times in 5 days." Silence. "I sent a letter." My mother's face crumpled. "I know," she whispered. "You sent it back unopened." The weight of that memory seemed to press the air from the room. Behind me, through the glass wall of the nurses' station, I could see several members of the night shift watching. They understood enough to know something important was unfolding. My father finally spoke again, his voice rough. "We didn't know." I studied him for a moment. Then I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "You did." Neither of them had a response to that, and the truth standing there between us in the bright hospital light felt impossible to ignore. 7 years of silence had just collapsed into a single moment. And it was only the beginning. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to bend the air. My parents stood a few feet away from me in the waiting room, their expressions caught somewhere between shock and something darker, something closer to realization. My mother spoke first. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Leora, we thought you left." The words trembled as they left her mouth like someone testing ice that might crack beneath their weight. "We thought you dropped out. That you didn't want us anymore." I looked at her for a long moment. 7 years ago, I would have rushed to explain myself again. I would have pleaded for understanding the way someone stranded at sea pleads for rescue. But that version of me had disappeared somewhere between medical school and the operating room. I never left, I said quietly. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. Then he asked the question I had been expecting since the moment I saw my sister's name on that chart. What really happened? The fluorescent lights above us hummed softly. I folded my arms. Vanessa called you? I said. 3 days after I told her about Sarah. My mother frowned. Sarah. My roommate, I explained. She had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Their faces shifted in confusion. I continued. I took a medical leave of absence to take care of her. Everything was official. The school approved it. My father stared at me. But Vanessa said yes, I said gently. I know what she said. I watched the realization begin to creep slowly across his face, the way dawn spreads across the horizon, gradual but unstoppable. She told you I dropped out, I continued, that I was living with a boyfriend who had a drug problem. My mother gasped softly, and that I was too ashamed to tell you the truth. My father looked as if someone had just knocked the breath out of him. That can't be right, he said weakly. But it is. I met his eyes. I called you 14 times after that. Neither of them moved. I sent emails with the paperwork attached. My mother's hands trembled. I wrote a letter. The memory of the unopened envelope hung between us like a ghost. You sent it back. My father ran a hand across his face. The confident, unshakable man who had once dominated every room he entered suddenly looked very old. Vanessa told us you were lying, he murmured. She showed us messages. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Fabricated ones, I said. Or edited ones. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother sank slowly into one of the waiting room chairs as if her legs had forgotten how to hold her up. Oh my God, she whispered. My father remained standing, but something in his posture had changed. The rigid certainty that had defined him my entire childhood seemed to be dissolving in real time. You mean, he said slowly, you never stopped being in medical school? No. You finished? Yes. And you? He glanced toward the hallway that led to the ICU. You were the surgeon who just saved Vanessa. Yes. The word landed softly, but its weight seemed enormous. My mother suddenly covered her mouth with both hands. Tears spilled freely now, quiet and uncontrollable. I thought you hated us, she whispered. I shook my head slowly. No. The answer surprised even me. I stopped trying, I said, because you had already decided who I was. The room fell silent again. Behind us, a nurse passed through the hallway pushing a cart. The wheels squeaked softly against the floor. Life in the hospital continued like nothing unusual was happening. But inside that waiting room, something enormous had shifted. My father finally spoke again. His voice sounded different now. Quieter. What happens now? He asked. I considered the question carefully. 7 years of absence cannot be repaired with a single conversation. Trust isn't a light switch. It's more like a broken bone. It takes time to set. And even then, the fracture never disappears completely. I don't know, I said honestly. But right now, I glanced down the hallway toward the ICU. Right now, your daughter is alive. My father followed my gaze. Thanks to you. I didn't answer, because the truth was more complicated than gratitude. I had saved my sister's life, but the surgery had opened something far deeper than an incision. The lie Vanessa told 7 years ago had just begun to unravel, and when the truth finally reached her hospital room upstairs, nothing in our family would ever look the same again. An hour later, I walked into the ICU. The hallway outside was quiet in the way hospitals often are just after sunrise, when the chaos of the night shift begins to fade and the day shift hasn't fully taken over yet. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in slow, steady rhythm. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Room 12. Vanessa's room. I stopped for a moment beside the door reading the chart clipped to the wall, even though I already knew every detail written there. Years of training had made the motion automatic, patient stable, post-operative monitoring, splenectomy completed, liver laceration repaired, alive. It was strange how such a simple word could carry so much weight. 7 years of anger had lived somewhere inside me like a quiet storm waiting for release. But standing there outside that hospital room, none of that fury felt quite as sharp as I had imagined it would. Maybe because anger loses some of its strength when the person you're angry at is lying in a hospital bed stitched back together by your own hands. I pushed the door open. The ICU room was dim, the lights softened to allow patients to rest. Machines surrounded the bed like silent guardians, monitors, IV pumps, oxygen lines. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room. Vanessa lay beneath the blankets, pale against the white sheets. Her dark hair was pulled loosely away from her face, and several tubes ran from beneath the blanket toward the machines beside her. For the first time since the accident, she looked peaceful. Not triumphant, not manipulative, just human. Her eyes were open, clouded slightly from anesthesia but awake. For a few seconds she stared up at the ceiling, blinking slowly as if trying to gather the scattered pieces of consciousness. Then her gaze drifted toward the doorway, toward me. It took a moment for recognition to form. Her eyebrows furrowed. She squinted. Then her eyes dropped to the badge clipped to my scrubs. Dr. Leora Grant, Chief of Trauma Surgery. Her lips parted slightly. Leora. Her voice was hoarse, fragile, like someone speaking through dry leaves. I stepped closer to the bed. Good morning, Vanessa. The words came out steady, controlled, professional. I'm the surgeon who performed your operation. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Her mind seemed to move slowly through the layers of realization. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something closer to shock. You're a doctor, she whispered. I nodded once. Chief trauma surgeon. The words landed in the room with quiet finality. Vanessa blinked again, as if she might wake up from a strange dream if she just waited long enough. That's not possible, she murmured weakly, but the machines beside her continued their steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Reality doesn't change just because someone wishes it would. I adjusted the IV drip, automatically checking the numbers on the monitor. You were in a serious car accident, I explained calmly. Your spleen ruptured and you had a deep liver laceration. We had to remove the spleen and repair the bleeding. She watched me closely now. The confusion in her eyes slowly began to sharpen into something more familiar. Calculation. It was a look I remembered well. Even as a child, Vanessa had always been quick to analyze situations, searching for the angle that gave her the most control. I told them you dropped out, she said suddenly. Her voice was dry, but the words were clear. I met her gaze. I know. Silence settled between us. Vanessa swallowed slowly. I didn't think, she began. Then her voice trailed off. You didn't think what I asked quietly. That I'd finish, I suggested. That I'd become a surgeon. Her eyes flickered away. She didn't answer. But she didn't have to. The truth was written across her face. I finished checking the drainage tube near her incision. Everything looked stable. No excessive bleeding. You'll recover, I said. It will take time, but the surgery went well. Vanessa looked back at me. Mom and Dad, she said suddenly. The words sounded careful. They're here, aren't they? Yes. Her breathing changed slightly. What did you tell them? The truth. The phrase hung in the air like a bell after it struck. Vanessa's expression shifted again. Not confusion this time. Fear. Not the fear of physical pain or surgical complications. Something deeper. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Which part telling them? The room fell quiet again. Outside the window, pale winter sunlight filtered through thin clouds, casting soft gray light across the floor. You had 7 years, I said calmly. 7 years to correct the lie. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the calculation had returned, but it looked weaker now, like a mask that had cracked. I thought you'd disappear, she said quietly. The words surprised me. After they cut you off? I thought you'd just fade away. I studied her face. There was something almost honest in that confession. I almost did, I admitted. But I didn't. The monitor beside her continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Vanessa stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she asked the question I had expected sooner or later. What happens now? For a moment, I considered the answer. 7 years ago, she had changed my life with a single phone call. But the balance of power had shifted since then. Now she was the one lying in a hospital bed. Now she was the one facing consequences she couldn't control. You recover, I said finally. You heal. Then I stepped back toward the door. And after that? I paused with my hand on the handle. After that, Vanessa, you explain everything to Mom and Dad. Her face went pale, because for the first time in 7 years the story wasn't hers to write anymore. The truth had already begun telling itself. My parents went into Vanessa's ICU room about 10 minutes after I left. I didn't stay to watch. Some conversations don't need witnesses. Instead, I walked down the quiet hallway and stepped outside the hospital for a few minutes. The winter air was sharp against my skin, cold enough to clear the fog from my thoughts. The sky was pale gray, the kind of morning that feels suspended between night and day. For 7 years, I had imagined this moment in dozens of different ways. Sometimes in those imagined scenes, I was angry, sometimes triumphant, sometimes calm and detached. But the truth felt stranger than any of those versions. It felt quiet, like the storm had already passed somewhere behind me. About 40 minutes later, Linda, the charge nurse, pushed open the hospital doors and stepped outside. You might want to come back upstairs, she said gently. Something in her tone told me everything. The truth had reached Vanessa, and it hadn't gone well. When I returned to the ICU floor, the tension was thick enough to feel. 2 nurses stood near the station whispering softly. They stopped when they saw me approach. Inside room 12, the door was half closed. Through the glass panel, I could see my parents standing beside the bed. My mother was crying. Not the quiet, controlled crying I had seen earlier in the waiting room. This was different. Her shoulders shook with deep, uneven sobs. My father stood beside the window with his back to the room, one hand pressed against the glass as if he needed something solid to lean on. Vanessa lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling. No tears, no dramatic defense, just silence. I pushed the door open slowly. All 3 of them looked toward me. My mother spoke first. Her voice sounded raw. Leora. For a moment she didn't say anything else. It was as if the apology inside her had become too large to fit through words. Finally, it came out in a broken whisper. We were wrong. The sentence seemed to collapse the room inward. My father turned from the window. I had seen him angry, confident, unyielding, but I had never seen him look like this. Small. I should have listened, he said quietly. I should have called you back. The weight of those words pressed against my chest. 7 years, 14 unanswered phone calls, an unopened letter. None of that could be undone now. I tried, I said simply. My mother nodded quickly, tears sliding down her cheeks. I know, she said. I know now. Behind her, Vanessa finally spoke. Her voice was weak from surgery but steady. I told them everything. The words hung in the air. Every lie. Every fabrication. Every message she had twisted or invented. The entire story had finally collapsed under its own weight. My father rubbed his hand across his face slowly. I spent 7 years believing you abandoned us, he said quietly. And the whole time, you were building a life. I didn't answer, because explaining those years would take more than a single conversation. Medical school, residency, the nights I slept in empty apartments, the mornings I woke up hoping just for a second that my phone might ring with a familiar number. Those were years no one could return to me, but they had shaped the person standing in that hospital room. Vanessa looked at me again. There was something different in her eyes now. Not calculation, not pride. Something closer to exhaustion. I thought if you disappeared, she said slowly, everything would go back to normal. A sad smile touched my lips. It didn't. No, she admitted quietly. I see that now. Silence settled between the four of us, not the cold silence of distance. Something softer, fragile, like the first thread of a bridge being rebuilt. My mother stepped forward hesitantly. This time, I didn't step back. Her arms wrapped around me carefully as if she were afraid I might vanish if she held too tightly. I'm so sorry, she whispered. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe. My father didn't hug me. He had never been a man who expressed emotions easily. But he stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. And for him, that was enough. Vanessa watched the moment quietly from the bed. The sister who had once destroyed my life was now the reason we were standing together again. Irony has a strange sense of humor. Before leaving the room, I turned back to her. You're going to need follow-up appointments, I said. Your immune system will be weaker without a spleen. She nodded. Then after a moment, she said something unexpected. Thank you. The words were simple, but they were the first honest ones she had offered me in a very long time. Weeks passed. Vanessa recovered slowly. My parents started showing up more often, not with grand gestures, but with quiet consistency. Phone calls, Sunday dinners, small attempts at rebuilding something that had once been broken. It wasn't perfect. Maybe it never would be. But something important had changed. The truth had finally taken its place in our story. And truth once spoken has a way of rebuilding things that lies can only destroy. One Sunday morning, a few months later, my parents came over for breakfast. Nathan was making coffee. Hippo sat under the table waiting patiently for crumbs. My father stood at the counter watching the French toast sizzle in the pan. After a moment, he cleared his throat. Need help setting the table? I smiled slightly. Yeah, I said. You can do that. He opened the cabinet and pulled out 4 plates. One by one, he placed them carefully on the table. 4. For the first time in 7 years. 4. And somehow that simple number felt like the beginning of something new. Stories like this leave something heavy and thoughtful inside me. Not because of the betrayal, but because of the choices that come after it. I learned that truth can survive a long silence, but relationships cannot survive without courage. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't proving you were right. It's deciding whether your heart still has room to forgive once the truth finally appears. I spent years believing my family had erased me, yet in the end I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be when they finally saw the truth. Saving my sister wasn't just a medical decision. It was a moment that forced me to choose the kind of character I wanted to carry through life. If you were standing where I stood after years of being misunderstood, hurt, and pushed aside, what would you do? Would you walk away forever? Or would you leave the door open just a little? I'm genuinely curious. And wherever you're listening from right now, tell me in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel and the different perspectives people bring with them. If this story moved you or made you think about someone in your own life, consider subscribing to the channel. One simple click from you helps stories like this reach people who might really need them. Like a comment or sharing this video might help someone else rethink a family conflict, forgive someone, or even find the courage to speak their truth. Sometimes the smallest actions online quietly help someone change their life, and that makes you part of the story too.